Have you ever stopped to think if what you see, remember, and swear happened is, in fact, reality as it was? It seems like a strange, almost uncomfortable question. After all, we spend our whole lives trusting our eyes, our memories, our certainties. But what if the brain, that extraordinary machine that interprets the world, isn't as reliable a witness as we believe? Imagine a simple, common situation. Two people are in the same place at the same time, witnessing exactly the same event. Minutes later, each describes what they saw differently. The details don't match. The emotions don't coincide. The conclusions are opposite. And then the impasse arises. If both were there looking at the same scene, who is telling the truth? Have you ever experienced this? Or perhaps you've been one of those people who, with absolute conviction, is sure they're right, even when someone swears otherwise. The most intriguing thing is that, most of the time, nobody is lying. There is no ill intent, nor a conscious attempt to distort the facts. Yet, reality seems to fragment into different versions. This leads us to a question that goes far beyond mere curiosity. Does the brain really register reality as it is? Or does it create its own version, adjusted, interpreted, and often distorted? From an early age, we learn to believe that perceiving is synonymous with registering. That seeing is believing. That remembering is accessing a faithful archive of the past. But neuroscience and studies on perception and memory show something much more unsettling. The brain doesn't work like a video camera, recording everything in a neutral and objective way. It selects, interprets, fills in gaps, and constructs meaning. And it does this all the time without asking permission, without warning us. What we call reality may actually be a subjective experience shaped by emotions, expectations, past experiences, and even the physical and mental state of the moment. The same stimulus can generate completely different perceptions depending on who is observing. The brain does not seek absolute truth. It seeks coherence, speed, and survival. What you are about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps even shake some certainties you have held for years. Think about how many times you've remembered something with complete certainty, and then discovered it wasn't quite like that. A conversation, a decision, a scene from the past that seemed crystal clear, but which, little by little, begins to show cracks. Did your memory fail you? Or was it never as accurate as you believed? Stay with me until the end, because understanding this completely changes how we see ourselves. The idea that the brain is a reliable witness to reality is comforting. It gives us security, control, and the feeling that we know what is happening around us. But questioning this confidence opens a disturbing door. If our perception can be misleading, to what extent are our certainties solid? To what extent is what we call real, nothing more than a narrative constructed within our own minds? Throughout this video, we'll explore how the brain interprets the world, how it builds memories, how emotions influence what we perceive, and why we are often so certain about things that never happened exactly that way. It's not about saying the brain lies, but about understanding how it works, and why it's much stranger than it first appears. Because, in the end, the seemingly simple question continues to echo. If reality passes through the brain before reaching you, what is actually being recorded? And it is from here that this story begins to get even more intriguing. And perhaps that's exactly why this topic affects us so much. Because at some level, we've all felt that silent unease of realizing that something doesn't quite fit. That strange feeling of, I remember this but I'm not sure, or, this is how it happened, at least that's how it seems. When we begin to question the brain as a witness to reality, we're not talking about something distant or theoretical. We're talking about our own experience of existing in the world. If, while you're listening to me now, any memory came to mind, any situation where two versions of the same story clashed, I'd love to know. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. It could be a question, a personal experience, or even that thought that's been nagging at you. This exchange is powerful because it shows how each mind constructs reality in a unique way, and that enriches the conversation for everyone watching. And if at any point you thought, this is interesting, or this made me think, consider liking the video. It seems simple, but this gesture helps the content reach more people who also enjoy exploring the mysteries of the brain, perception, and the human mind. That's how this type of reflection continues to circulate, reaching those who don't even know they have these questions stored away. Now, if you're curious about topics like this, if questioning reality, understanding how the brain works, and exploring strange phenomena of the mind fascinates you more than ready-made answers, subscribe to the channel. By doing so, you're saying you want to continue this journey, that you want to delve deeper into this type of conversation and follow the next chapters of this exploration. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, creating a community that isn't satisfied with superficial explanations. And stay with me because from here on out we're going to start dismantling, step by step, this idea that perceiving is the same as registering. We're going to enter the territory where the brain ceases to be merely a passive observer and begins to assume a much more active, and sometimes unsettling role in the construction of what we call reality. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where many people begin to feel uncomfortable, and, at the same time, curiously drawn to it. The idea that the brain doesn't record reality like a camera often sounds strange at first. After all, we grow up believing that our eyes capture the world, that the brain registers this information, and that afterwards, we just need to rewind our memory to access what happened. Simple, logical, reliable. But the real functioning is quite different, and much more revealing. The brain is not a recording device. It is an active interpreter of reality. This means that, every second, it receives an absurd amount of stimuli and needs to decide what is relevant, what can be ignored, and how all of this will be organized into a coherent story. There is no neutrality in this process. There is choice, filtering, and construction. Perception is not a faithful copy of the outside world. It is an edited, adapted, and adjusted version to make sense within our minds. Think of something simple from everyday life. You enter a familiar environment like your home and walk into a room. You don't consciously notice every object, every detail, every sound. Yet, you move confidently as if you were fully aware of everything around you. This happens because the brain isn't seeing everything anew. It's anticipating. It fills in the scene based on what it already expects to find. Reality, in this case, is almost a backdrop for a narrative that was already prepared. This mechanism is incredibly efficient, but it comes at a price. When the brain anticipates too much, it begins to confuse expectation with perception. What you think you saw starts to have the same weight as what was actually there. And it is at this point that the truth begins to become less solid than it seems. The mind prefers speed and coherence to absolute precision. It wants quick decisions, not perfect records. This completely changes how we understand memories, decisions, and even conflicts. When two people disagree about a fact, we are not just faced with different opinions. We are faced with different interpretations constructed from the very first second of the experience. Each brain has organized stimuli in its own way, influenced by emotions, beliefs, past experiences, and even the physical state of the moment. Reality is born different for each person. And the more emotionally charged the situation, the stronger this distortion can become. Emotions are not just reactions to what happens. They actively shape what is perceived. Fear, anxiety, expectation, euphoria, all of these alter how the brain interprets the world. It's no coincidence that intense moments often generate vivid, but not always reliable, memories. The emotional impact gives a sense of clarity when, in fact, it may be amplifying unreal details and erasing others completely. This process happens behind the scenes in the mind without warning. You don't notice the brain choosing, discarding, or adjusting information. Everything arrives ready-made with a feeling of absolute truth. And that's exactly what makes the experience so convincing. The interpretation comes with certainty. The mind doesn't say, "This is one possible version of what happened." It states, "This is how it was." And we believe it. Throughout life, this shapes our mindset, our worldview, and the way we make decisions. If the foundation of perception is already built, every choice stems from that construction. We decide based on versions of reality, not on reality itself. This doesn't mean we're always wrong, but it does mean we're always interpreting. The journey of understanding the brain involves accepting this hidden truth. We don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are able to process it. Perhaps that's why some discussions seem impossible to resolve. It's not just stubbornness or lack of empathy. It's different internal realities trying to coexist. Each person defends what, for them, is evident. Questioning the brain as a witness is also questioning how we position ourselves in relation to others. It's realizing that conviction doesn't guarantee accuracy. And this doesn't make the human experience any less valuable, it makes it more complex. There is something profoundly transformative in accepting that our perception is limited, constructed, and often flawed. This awareness opens up space for curiosity, for listening, and for a more honest relationship with our own certainties. Instead of seeing the mind as a faulty camera, we begin to see it as a narrator trying to make sense of the chaos. What's most fascinating is that the brain does this all the time, even when you believe you're just passively observing. It creates continuity where there are fragments. It creates logic where there are gaps. It creates stories where there is loose data. This capacity is what allows us to function in the world, but it's also what distances us from a completely objective perception. The reality we live in is, to a large extent, an internal experience. And the more you reflect on it, the more you realize the impact of this construct on everything. Relationships, memories, choices, regrets, and certainties. It's not about distrusting everything, but about understanding how everything is filtered. This understanding changes how you see yourself, how you see others, and how you deal with what you call truth. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where perception begins to reveal something we rarely stop to question. When we talk about seeing, we tend to assume that understanding comes automatically along with it, as if the simple act of looking were enough to comprehend what is before us. But the truth is that seeing and understanding are very different processes, and often move in opposite directions. Our senses don't capture the whole world. They capture fragments. Small snippets of a reality that is much broader, more complex, and richer than we are consciously able to perceive. The amount of information around us is immense, but the brain only receives a tiny fraction of it. Even so, we have the constant feeling that we are seeing everything, hearing everything, understanding everything. This feeling of completeness doesn't come from the senses. It comes from interpretation. The brain functions as a great organizer of chaos. It receives incomplete, disconnected, and often ambiguous signals. From this, it constructs a coherent narrative as quickly as possible. It connects the dots, creates continuity, eliminates contradictions, and fills in gaps without consulting us. The perception that reaches consciousness is already a final product, an edited version of the experience. We don't see raw reality. We see what the brain managed to organize in time. That's why we are so often absolutely certain about something that later turns out to be inaccurate. A face recognized from a distance that wasn't who we thought it was. A sentence heard halfway through that took on a different meaning. A gesture interpreted as a threat, contempt, or interest when it was none of those things. The brain prefers to err by completing the sentence rather than hesitate by admitting it doesn't know. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, and the mind does everything to avoid it. This constant filling happens because the brain hates emptiness. Cognitive gaps generate tension. So, to maintain a sense of control and fluidity, it uses past experiences, expectations, beliefs, and already known patterns to fill in what is missing. The result is a perception that seems solid, continuous, and reliable, even when it is not entirely faithful to what is happening. This is where scientific curiosity begins to become unsettling. Because if the brain is always completing information, then perception is never neutral. It carries our history, our mentality, our fears, desires, and convictions. Each person lives within a reality constructed from these filters. And this explains why the same event can generate completely different understandings in different people. When two people disagree about something they both saw, we're not just dealing with differing opinions. We're dealing with distinct internal constructs. Each brain has chosen what to notice, what to ignore, and how to interpret what has come through the senses. The truth in this case doesn't disappear, it fragments. What exists are plausible versions, not identical records. The more familiar a situation is, the more the brain relies on mental shortcuts. It begins to anticipate what will happen even before observing it carefully. This anticipation saves energy and speeds up decisions, but it also increases the risk of distortion. The mind sees what it expects to see. And often, it fails to see what doesn't fit into the existing narrative. Perception becomes confirmation. This process has a profound impact on how we make decisions. Decisions are rarely based on pure facts. They arise from what we believe we understand. If the initial perception has already been filtered and completed, all subsequent reasoning is built upon that foundation. Small errors at the beginning can lead to major consequences later. And the most intriguing thing is that all of this happens with a constant sense of clarity. There is something transformative in recognizing this workings. Not to live distrusting everything, but to develop a more conscious attitude towards one's own experience. To understand that perceiving is not receiving but interpreting. That understanding is not automatic but constructed. This awareness changes the way we deal with conflicts, with quick judgments, and with rigid certainties. Perception is not merely a window to the external world. It is a constant dialogue between what comes from outside and what already exists within. Emotions, expectations, and past experiences actively participate in this dialogue. The brain doesn't ask, what is really there? It asks, what makes the most sense to me right now? And this question guides the entire construction of reality. Behind the scenes of the mind, this process happens so quickly and efficiently that it seems invisible. Everything arrives ready-made, organized, with the appearance of absolute truth. That's why questioning perception causes discomfort. We don't like the idea that what we see may not be exactly what it is. We prefer to believe that our senses give us direct access to the world, when, in fact, they only offer raw material for interpretation. This realization has a silent but profound impact. It affects how we communicate, how we react to difference, and how we defend our convictions. When we understand that perception is constructed, we become more attentive to our own reactions and more open to the possibility of other interpretations of reality. Not because everything is relative, but because everything is mediated. The journey of understanding perception is fundamentally a journey of cognitive humility. It's about accepting that the brain is brilliant, efficient, and creative, but not infallible. It creates meaning to keep us functional, not to deliver absolute truth. This revelation doesn't diminish the human experience. It makes it richer, more complex, and more interesting. And when this idea begins to take hold, an inevitable question arises, almost like an echo. If what we see arrives already complete, edited, and interpreted, to what extent can we fully trust our own perception of reality? This doubt does not end the matter. It deepens the reflection and opens the way to understanding how memory, emotion, and conviction enter into this same game of silent construction. Write this down, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we enter the territory of memory, something begins to stir within us. It's not just scientific curiosity, it's discomfort. Memory occupies a special place in our lives. It sustains our identity, gives continuity to our history, and offers us the feeling that we know who we are because we remember where we came from. Questioning memory is not just questioning facts, it's touching the very foundation of what we call self. We often think of memory as a reliable archive, a place where events are kept, intact, waiting to be accessed when we need them. As if each memory were stored in a specific drawer, preserved from time and interference. But this image is a comforting illusion. Memory doesn't work like a safe. It works as a constantly transforming process. Every time you remember something, that memory isn't simply retrieved from storage and displayed. It's reconstructed. The brain takes fragments of what was recorded, mixes them with current emotions, beliefs, expectations, and even information acquired after the original event. What emerges isn't a faithful copy of the past, but a new version of it. And the most intriguing thing is that this new version begins to seem as authentic as the original. This mechanism creates a powerful sense of certainty. When we remember something, we feel we are accessing the truth. The image comes with details, emotions, and conviction. But this certainty does not guarantee accuracy. On the contrary, the more times a memory is accessed, the more opportunities there are for it to be altered. Each memory carries small changes, almost imperceptible adjustments, that accumulate over time. This explains why old memories can change without us realizing it. A childhood event can take on new meanings in adulthood. A conversation can seem harsher or gentler depending on when it is remembered. A mistake can grow or diminish according to the narrative we construct about it. Memory adapts to our journey. It preserves not only what happened but what makes sense now. There is something profoundly human in this process. The brain isn't interested in keeping precise historical records. It's interested in emotional coherence and identity. Memories help sustain an ongoing narrative about who we are. If something doesn't quite fit into that story, memory tends to adjust the contours. Not out of malice but out of psychological necessity. This is one of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes aspects of the mind. Memory doesn't just record experiences, it actively participates in building our mindset. It influences decisions, shapes relationships, and guides future choices. When we believe we remember something the way it was, we are often remembering it the way we need it to have been in order to maintain a sense of meaning. That's why conflicts based on memories are so difficult to resolve. Each person defends their version with absolute sincerity. Not because someone is lying, but because each memory has been reconstructed differently over time. Different emotions, different contexts, different meanings. The truth becomes diluted in equally convincing internal narratives. This process also explains why certain memories seem to gain strength over the years. They become clearer, more detailed, more emotionally charged. Not because they were preserved but because they were revisited many times. Each access reinforces certain elements and erases others. Memory consolidates not as a record but as history. There's something unsettling about that. Because it means that fully trusting memory is trusting something mutable. Something that silently changes while we believe we are accessing something fixed. This cognitive discomfort arises when we realize that the past is not a stable place. It is always being reinterpreted in the light of the present. But at the same time, there is something transformative in this revelation. Understanding that remembering is reconstructing gives us a new perspective on ourselves. We realize that our identity is not a rigid set of facts, but a constantly adjusting narrative. This can generate insecurity but also freedom. If memories change, the way we see ourselves can also change. This understanding has a profound impact on the decisions we make today. Many choices are based on past experiences, successes, failures, pain, achievements. But if these experiences are remembered in a reconstructed way, then our decisions also carry these reconstructions. We don't just decide based on what happened, but based on the story we tell ourselves about what happened. Behind the scenes of the mind, memory works silently, shaping perceptions, reinforcing beliefs, and sustaining certainties. It gives the sensation of continuity even when the content changes. And perhaps that's why questioning it causes so much discomfort. We don't like the idea that the past isn't as fixed as we imagine. We prefer to believe it's solid because that gives us stability. But when we begin to accept that memory is alive, malleable, and sensitive to context, something changes. We start to look at our memories with more curiosity and less rigidity. We understand that remembering is not about going back in time, but about reinterpreting the journey. This perception alters how we deal with regrets, guilt, and even the pride in certain achievements. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we combine perception and memory, we begin to see something even more revealing about how the brain constructs convictions and certainties. If what we see is interpreted, and what we remember is reconstructed, what happens to the feeling of absolute truth that we carry about so many things? Write this down, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we talk about emotions, we enter territory that everyone knows intimately, even without realizing it. Emotions are not just fleeting reactions to what happens around us. They function as an invisible filter of reality, shaping what we perceive, remember, and believe. And the most curious thing is that this filter acts even before we are aware of it. Fear, stress, anxiety, expectation, euphoria. Each of these emotions silently alters how the world appears to us. In intense emotional states, the brain changes its priorities. It stops seeking precision and starts seeking security. Not because it wants to distort reality, but because, from a biological point of view, survival has always been more important than perfectly understanding what is happening. When we are under stress, for example, the brain goes into alert mode. Attention narrows, focus concentrates on potential threats, and anything that doesn't seem immediately relevant is set aside. In this state, details disappear, nuances are lost, and quick interpretations gain strength. Reality becomes simpler, more binary, more urgent. There is no room for deep analysis when the mind believes it needs to react quickly. Anxiety works similarly, but with one important detail: it projects danger into the future. The brain begins to interpret neutral events as signs of something wrong that is yet to happen. Silence becomes rejection. A delay becomes indifference. A look becomes judgment. Perception ceases to be about the present and becomes contaminated by anticipations. What is felt gains more weight than what is observed. Expectation also plays a powerful role in this process. When we expect something, good or bad, the brain prepares to confirm that expectation. It begins to select information that reinforces what is already expected. If you enter a situation believing that something will go wrong, every small negative detail stands out. If you believe it will go right, the same details may be ignored. Reality doesn't change, but the experience changes completely. Fear, perhaps the most primitive filter of all, is even more direct. It reorganizes perception around the threat. Sounds seem louder, movements seem more abrupt, intentions seem more hostile. The brain is not interested in subtleties when it believes there is risk. It prefers to err on the side of caution than to fail through detailed analysis. In this state, emotional interpretation prevails over any attempt at objectivity. All of this happens automatically behind the scenes of the mind. We don't choose to feel first and then perceive. Most of the time we feel and, from that, we perceive. Emotion comes before explanation. It colors the experience and guides the internal narrative that the brain constructs about what is happening. Emotional perception arrives ready-made with the feeling of absolute truth. This mechanism has a profound impact on how we remember events. Intense emotions leave strong marks on memory, but not necessarily precise marks. A moment experienced with fear may be remembered as more threatening than it actually was. An event experienced with euphoria may seem more positive than the facts would justify. Emotional memory records not only what happened but mainly how it made you feel. This is where an uncomfortable but inevitable question arises. When you remember something significant, are you remembering the reality that happened, or the reality that you felt? Often, the feeling becomes the center of the memory, and the facts orbit around it. Emotion gives coherence to the story, even if it means distorting important details. This process directly influences our decisions. We decide based on past experiences charged with emotion. We avoid situations that made us feel bad, even if rationally we know they are not dangerous. We seek to repeat situations that gave us pleasure, even when the context has changed. Our mindset is shaped not by objective facts, but by the emotional impact those facts had on us. Behind the scenes, this makes perfect sense in the brain. An organism that survived for thousands of years needed to react quickly to threats, not analyze them calmly. Precision was never the absolute priority. The priority was always to stay alive. The modern brain still carries this ancient logic, even living in a completely different world. It reacts emotionally before reflecting rationally. Understanding this can be profoundly transformative. Not to deny emotions, but to recognize them as filters, not as final truths. Emotions inform, but they also distort. They reveal something important about us, but not necessarily about external reality. This awareness changes how we deal with conflicts, judgments, and rigid certainties. When we realize that emotion shapes perception, we gain space to pause, to question automatic interpretations, to differentiate what was felt from what actually happened. This is neither simple nor immediate. It is a journey of self-discovery that demands attention and openness. But it is a journey that increases clarity and reduces rigidity. Emotional reality is intense, compelling, and often unforgettable. But it's not the only layer of experience. Behind it lies a complex construct where perception, memory, and emotion intertwine to create what we call personal truth. And the more we understand this intertwining, the more we realize that our certainties are less solid than they seem. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we combine emotion, memory, and perception, we begin to touch on something even more delicate. The way the brain constructs convictions so strong that they come to seem indisputable, even when they were born from momentary emotional filters. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where the experience starts to get truly perplexing. There's a point where the brain not only interprets, reconstructs, or filters reality, it begins to swear that something happened. Not as a hypothesis, not as a doubt, but as absolute certainty. And the most intriguing thing is that this conviction can arise even when there is no concrete evidence whatsoever that it is true. We've all experienced moments like this. A memory that seems incredibly real, rich in detail, full of emotion, but which finds no confirmation outside our own minds. A conversation you're sure happened that way, but that another person simply doesn't recognize. An event you know you experienced but which, when questioned, begins to reveal small inconsistencies. Still, the feeling of truth remains firm. The brain doesn't hesitate. It affirms it. This is one of the strangest phenomena of the human mind. The ability to generate certainties without proof. The brain doesn't need external evidence to create internal conviction. It constructs a narrative so coherent, so emotionally consistent, that doubt simply finds no space. The feeling of familiarity, for example, can arise out of nowhere. A place you've never visited seems familiar. An unknown person awakens a strange intimacy. A new event carries a sense of repetition. And even without a logical explanation, the brain insists, this has already happened. These experiences are profoundly impactful because they challenge our notion of reality. We have been taught to trust internal certainties as signs of truth. If something seems real, if it sounds real, if it comes with emotion and clarity, then it must be real. But the brain doesn't follow this criterion. It creates convictions based on patterns, associations, and shortcuts that operate behind the scenes of consciousness. False memories are a powerful example of this. It's not about conscious imagination or deliberate fantasy. These are memories that emerge strongly with visual details, bodily sensations, and emotional charge. For those experiencing them, they are indistinguishable from authentic memories. The brain fills in gaps, connects scattered information, and produces a complete story. And once created, this story is defended as truth. What's most disconcerting is that the more emotionally significant a memory seems, the more credible it sounds. Emotion acts as a seal of authenticity. If it touched you deeply, then it must have happened. But, as we've seen, emotion is no guarantee of accuracy. It's merely an amplifier. It strengthens the narrative, not necessarily the facts. This mechanism reveals something important about the human mindset. The brain wasn't designed to be an impartial judge of reality. It was designed to create meaning, continuity, and identity. Strong convictions help sustain a stable narrative about who we are and how the world works. Constant doubt would be paralyzing. So the brain prefers to assert with certainty, even at the risk of being wrong. Behind the scenes, this explains why certain beliefs are so difficult to shake. A conviction created internally, reinforced by emotion and repetition, becomes resistant to contrary evidence. It's not conscious stubbornness. It's internal consistency. The brain protects the story it has constructed because it supports past decisions, choices made, and the image we have of ourselves. The feeling of familiarity without apparent reason also falls into this category. It arises when the brain recognizes partial patterns and automatically completes the rest. Something sounds familiar because it vaguely resembles something else, even if there is no direct connection. But the feeling arrives ready-made with the force of a certainty. The brain doesn't say, "This looks like something." It says, "This is familiar." And this affirmation is felt, not thought. These phenomena show how the line between real experience and mental construct is much thinner than we like to admit. Internal reality can be as convincing as external reality, and often more powerful. Important decisions are made based on these internal convictions. Relationships are affected. Conflicts arise. Life stories are shaped. There is something profoundly transformative in recognizing this. Not to discredit everything we feel, but to understand the weight we give to internal certainties. Questioning doesn't mean denying. It means opening space for investigation. It means recognizing that conviction is not synonymous with absolute truth. That subjective clarity can coexist with objective error. This revelation changes how we deal with intense memories, with quick judgments, and with that feeling of, "I know it was like this." It invites us to a more curious and less defensive stance. To accept that the brain can be sincerely convinced, and still be wrong. This is not a weakness of the mind. It is a consequence of its functioning. When we understand that the brain can swear that something happened even when it didn't, we begin to look at our certainties more carefully. Not to automatically discard them, but to investigate them. To separate sensation from fact. Emotion from evidence. Narrative from event. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we combine conviction, emotion, and memory, we begin to touch on something even more sensitive. The way the brain constructs such solid versions of reality that they come to guide behaviors, decisions, and entire identities, even when they originated from flawed interpretations. Write this down, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where one of the most deeply ingrained beliefs in our lives begins to waver. From a very young age, we learn a simple and seemingly logical rule. Seeing is believing. If I saw it, then it happened. If my eyes confirm it, there's nothing to question. This idea accompanies us in decisions, judgments, discussions, and even in cherished memories. But the problem isn't trusting our vision, it's believing that this trust guarantees accuracy. There is a huge difference between feeling certain and being right. And the brain is extremely skilled at making us confuse these two things. When we say, "I trust what I saw," most of the time we are saying, "I trust the interpretation that my brain constructed from what I saw." This distinction seems subtle, but it changes everything. Because what reaches consciousness is not the raw data, but the meaning that has already been processed, organized, and explained. Subjective confidence is powerful. It comes with security, firmness, and even authority. Those who trust what they have seen speak with conviction, take a strong stance, and rarely accept being questioned. Socially, this confidence is often interpreted as a sign of truth. After all, if someone speaks with such certainty, they must be right. But the brain doesn't use confidence as an indicator of accuracy. It uses confidence as a tool for internal consistency. Behind the scenes, the brain needs to believe in its own narrative to function well. Constant doubt breeds hesitation, and hesitation hinders quick decisions. So, when an interpretation is constructed, it comes with an internal seal of reliability. Not because it has been verified, but because it needs to appear solid. This subjective solidity underpins choices, attitudes, and even personal identity. This is where seeing is believing begins to show its fragility. The act of seeing is not neutral. It has already passed through sensory, emotional, and cognitive filters before transforming into understanding. When we blindly trust what we have seen, we are ignoring this entire intermediate process. We are assuming that conscious experience is equivalent to objective reality, and this equivalence rarely exists. This misconception has a huge impact on human relationships. How many conflicts begin with phrases like, "I saw it clearly," or, "I know what happened because I was there"? Each of these statements carries a legitimate conviction, but not necessarily an accurate one. The problem is not the honesty of the speaker, but the excessive confidence in one's own perception. Internal certainty becomes the final argument, when it should only be a starting point. There is something philosophical and, at the same time, very practical in all of this. Questioning seeing is believing doesn't mean denying reality or living in absolute relativism. It means recognizing the limits of the observer. It means understanding that objective truth is not automatically revealed by subjective experience. The brain delivers a plausible version, not a guarantee of accuracy. This confusion between trust and accuracy affects important decisions. People make professional, emotional, and moral decisions based on interpretations that seem obvious, but which stem from incomplete perceptions. A look interpreted as disinterest can create distance. A gesture seen as a threat can generate an exaggerated reaction. A misunderstood detail can change the course of an entire relationship. And all this happens with the intimate feeling of acting based on facts. The authority of one's own perception is seductive. It gives us a sense of control in a complex and unpredictable world. Admitting that what we saw may not be exactly what happened requires cognitive humility. It demands accepting that the mind, despite being brilliant, is not infallible. And this acceptance is not always comfortable. On the contrary, it challenges the way we build certainties throughout life. The brain prefers clear stories to correct ones. A coherent narrative, even if imprecise, is easier to sustain than a narrative full of gaps and doubts. Therefore, when we see something and make sense of it, the mind tends to close the story quickly. The faster the closure, the greater the feeling of confidence. And the greater the confidence, the less openness to revision. This mechanism explains why contrary evidence doesn't always change opinions. When someone says, "But I saw it," they're not just defending a fact, they're defending their own perceptual integrity. Questioning what was seen sounds like questioning one's own ability to understand the world. That's why the brain reacts with resistance. Not out of arrogance, but out of self-protection. Recognizing this is profoundly transformative. Not to live doubting everything, but to differentiate conviction from accuracy. To understand that feeling certain is not proof of truth. To create space between stimulus and interpretation. This small distance changes mindset, reduces conflict, and expands the capacity for revision. When we begin to question, "I trust what I saw," we start to listen more, ask more, and assert less. Not because we know less, but because we understand better how knowledge is formed. Perception ceases to be a final judgment and becomes an initial hypothesis. This does not weaken human experience, it strengthens it. This reflection doesn't distance us from reality. On the contrary, it brings us closer to it in a more honest way. The hidden truth lies not in denying the senses, but in understanding their limits. The impact of this spreads to all areas of life, from simple decisions to major existential choices. It's a silent but profound journey of reviewing what we've always taken for granted. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because when we question blind trust in perception, we inevitably arrive at an even more delicate point. If seeing doesn't guarantee truth, how does the brain decide what to believe? And why do some certainties become practically indisputable within our minds? Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after all this, a provocative, perhaps even unfair, but inevitable question almost automatically arises. So is the brain a liar? When we realize that it interprets, fills in gaps, reconstructs memories, filters emotions, and creates strong convictions even when it is wrong, the temptation is to put the brain in the dock. But this hasty judgment misses something essential about how the mind really works. The brain doesn't lie in the moral sense of the word. It doesn't deceive intentionally. What it does is something much older, deeper, and more strategic. It seeks efficiency. The brain's primary function has never been to record reality with absolute perfection. Its function has always been to allow the organism to survive, orient itself in the environment, and make decisions quick enough to continue existing. Total precision is a luxury. Efficiency is a necessity. When we look at it from this angle, many things begin to make sense. The brain creates versions of reality because it needs to act before having all the information. It constructs plausible stories because waiting for the complete truth can be too costly. In evolutionary terms, it was better to err quickly than to be right late. This principle continues to operate behind the scenes of the modern mind, even in situations that no longer involve real danger. This adaptive efficiency explains why perception is immediate, why memory is malleable, and why emotions take priority. All of this reduces the cognitive cost of existing in a complex world. The brain simplifies, organizes, and closes narratives because constant chaos would be unsustainable. Raw reality is too fragmented to be experienced without editing. This doesn't make the brain defective. It makes it functional. It delivers a coherent enough experience for us to move forward, make decisions, build relationships, and maintain a sense of identity. The problem arises when we confuse this coherence with absolute truth. When we assume that the version we receive is the only possible one or the most accurate, simply because it seems clear and convincing. The hidden truth is that the brain works with approximations. It creates models of the world, not exact copies. These models are constantly adjusted, reinforced, or discarded as new experiences emerge. However, most of the time, we don't perceive this adjustment process. The model arrives ready-made with the appearance of definitive reality. And that's where the discomfort lies. This reframing completely changes the initial question. Instead of, does the brain lie? Perhaps the more honest question is, how precise do we need reality to be in order to function? Because, for the brain, functioning has always been more important than getting every detail right. It prioritizes meaning, continuity, and action. Perfection was never the goal. This logic is reflected in how we make decisions every day. We decide based on incomplete information, quick perceptions, and reconstructed memories. And yet, most of these decisions work reasonably well. Not because they are perfectly aligned with objective reality, but because they are aligned with the internal narrative that underpins our mindset at that moment. There is something profoundly transformative in accepting this. Not as an excuse for error, but as an invitation to awareness. When we understand that the brain delivers functional versions of reality, we begin to treat our certainties with more care. They remain important, but they cease to be untouchable. Conviction becomes a tool, not final proof. This understanding also generates empathy. When another person sees something completely differently, it's not necessarily because they are wrong or malicious. It may be because their brain has constructed an equally efficient version of the story they experienced. Two versions can coexist without either being a complete lie. Both are adaptations. Behind the scenes of the mind, this adaptive efficiency underpins everything we are. It shapes our identity, guides our choices, and maintains a sense of continuity over time. The brain needs to believe in its own narrative to move forward. Without this, there would be paralysis, constant doubt, and loss of direction. Subjective clarity is the fuel for action. But this same efficiency comes at a price. The price is the illusion that what makes sense quickly is also necessarily true. When we fail to recognize this limit, we begin to defend imperfect versions of reality as if they were irrefutable truths. And that's where conflicts, rigidity, and unnecessary suffering arise. Recognizing that the brain doesn't lie but rather simplifies, changes the relationship we have with our own experiences. We begin to observe thoughts, memories, and perceptions with more curiosity and less attachment. This doesn't weaken our confidence, it strengthens our clarity. The mindset becomes more flexible, more open to revisions, and better prepared to deal with complexity. This reframing maintains an interesting tension in the air. Because if the brain creates efficient versions of reality and not perfect portraits, then a silent question still lingers in the back of the mind: how to distinguish what merely makes sense from what actually happened. This question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It prepares the ground for an even deeper reflection on truth, consciousness, and perceptual responsibility. Write this down: I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because we've reached a point where reflection ceases to be merely scientific curiosity and begins to touch on something much more intimate. There's an uncomfortable truth about reality that we avoid facing precisely because it shakes everything that gives us security. After exploring perception, memory, emotion, conviction, and adaptive efficiency, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the idea that the brain is an impartial witness to the world. And perhaps it never intended to be. The brain doesn't observe reality from the outside. It's too involved for that. It participates, interferes, organizes, and narrates. Instead of a neutral judge, it behaves like an interested narrator, someone who needs to tell a coherent story so that the experience of existing makes sense. This story doesn't arise from a commitment to absolute truth, but from the need for continuity, identity, and action. The brain doesn't ask, what really happened? It asks, what makes sense now for me to move forward? This realization is disturbing because it dismantles a silent belief we've always held, that there is a fully accessible objective reality, requiring only sufficient attention to reach it. But what we experience in practice is a constructed reality. A functional version of the world, shaped by the limits of the senses, by emotional filters, by reconstructed memories, and by the quick decisions we need to make every day. It's not a faithful reproduction. It's a viable interpretation. And this doesn't happen occasionally. It happens all the time. At every instant, the brain is editing the experience, choosing what goes into the frame and what stays out. It adjusts contrasts, fills in gaps, smooths out inconsistencies and reinforces elements that support the main narrative. The result is a reality that seems solid, continuous, and reliable, precisely because it was constructed to appear that way. This construct has a profound impact on how we live. Our decisions don't stem from the world as it is, but from the world as it appears to us. Our mindset is formed from these internal versions of reality. Our judgments, fears, expectations, and certainties are organized around narratives that the brain considers functional. And, most of the time, this works well enough to keep life moving forward. The problem arises when we confuse functionality with truth. When we start defending our internal versions of reality as if they were indisputable facts. When we forget that what seems obvious to us may be just an efficient construct, not an accurate description. This confusion fuels conflict, rigidity of thought, and a constant feeling that the world should conform to our way of seeing it. There is something profoundly transformative in recognizing that lived reality is a construct. Not because everything is false, but because everything is mediated. This doesn't throw us into empty relativism, nor does it force us to distrust everything all the time. On the contrary, this recognition broadens awareness. It creates space for healthy doubt, for genuine listening, and for revising certainties that previously seemed immutable. When we understand that the brain is an interested narrator, we begin to look at our own stories with more curiosity. We start to notice how certain narratives repeat themselves, how some versions of the past are strengthened while others disappear, how certain interpretations become pillars of our identity. None of this happens by chance. These are silent choices made behind the scenes of the mind to maintain internal coherence. This coherence is powerful. It gives us the feeling of knowing who we are and where we are. But it can also imprison us in limited versions of reality. The uncomfortable truth is that many of our deepest certainties are not reflections of the external world, but consequences of how the brain has learned to tell our own story. And questioning that story requires courage. This journey of questioning is not about denying human experience, but about deepening it. It's about recognizing that what we call reality is, to a large extent, an interface between the world and the mind. A necessary, efficient, and imperfect interface. The brain doesn't deliver the world to us as it is, it delivers the world to us as we are able to bear, understand, and navigate it. And perhaps that's why this reflection is so unsettling. Because it undermines absolute certainty, but doesn't offer a replacement. It leaves us in an intermediate territory, where reality and interpretation coexist. Where truth and meaning don't always go hand in hand. Where understanding becomes a continuous process, not a destination. This is the silent climax of this conversation. Not a definitive answer but a shift in perspective. When we accept that the brain is not an impartial witness, but an interested narrator, everything changes. Reality ceases to be something simply discovered and becomes something constantly constructed. And this invites us to a different stance towards the world and ourselves. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because if what we experience as reality depends on the brain to exist in that way, then a question arises that won't go away, a question that echoes and prepares the ground for everything that follows. If reality depends on the brain, what is real after all? Comment below, this makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation has truly stayed with you until the end, and that says a lot. This type of reflection isn't common, it's not quick, and it's not superficial, so it makes sense that only those willing to look a little deeper will stay. If this content has helped you see reality, the brain, or even yourself from a different angle, consider subscribing to the channel. The idea here is exactly that, to create an ongoing space to question, understand, and delve into topics that usually go unnoticed in everyday life. If any part of this video seemed to speak directly to you, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." I like to know who made it to the end and how this journey resonated with them. This exchange closes the cycle of the conversation and gives meaning to everything we build here. And if at any point you felt that silent connection, that it makes sense feeling that doesn't need much explanation, leave a like on the video. It's a simple way to show that this conversation was worthwhile and helps this content continue to find people who are also open to this type of reflection. Now, there's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic and delves even deeper into the idea of perception, mind, and reality. Click on it and continue the conversation with me there. The conversation doesn't end here, it just shifts to a new level.